Poor! She hissed the word across the polished marble of the country club foyer, her voice carrying just enough to make heads turn. Darling, you don't belong here. This is a club for people who actually made it. Her smirk burned itself into my memory, her designer heels clicking away as though she had just sentenced me to exile from the world of the affluent. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her venom-laced insult would cost her the very sanctuary she used to flaunt her status. The same sanctuary I would one day own, piece by piece, brick by brick, until her membership card was nothing but a revoked scrap of plastic in the hands of a security guard. It began long before that public humiliation. Back then, I was new money, the kind people like her dismissed with a single glance. My fortune wasn't inherited. It was built from gritted teeth, sleepless nights, and the kind of stubbornness that turns rejections into fuel. I had clawed my way into wealth through real estate, buying crumbling neighborhoods no one wanted and turning them into thriving communities. But for people like Vivian Carrington, the woman who called me poor, that didn't count. To her, worth wasn't measured by vision or perseverance. It was measured in lineage, in last names, etched onto brass plaques. The day I first set foot in the Oak Crest Country Club, I was more curious than eager. I'd received the invitation from a client who thought it might help me network with the right people. The club itself was opulent, massive chandeliers dripping with crystal, velvet armchairs tucked neatly around fireplaces, walls lined with oil portraits of smug-faced men whose fortunes had been handed to them with their first breaths. It was intimidating, yes, but it also smelled faintly of mothballs and decay, old wealth, pretending it still held the world in its grip. I had barely ordered my first drink at the mahogany bar when Vivian swooped in. Tall, blonde, and dressed in something that probably cost more than my first investment property, she looked at me as if I'd tracked mud across her Persian rug. "You're new," she said, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. I smiled politely. "First time here, yes, I know who you are." She cut me off with a dismissive wave. "The developer. The one flipping ghettos into, what did you call them? Urban retreats? How quaint?" Her laugh was delicate, rehearsed, and cruel. I forced my grin to hold. "Well, people seem happy to live there." "People without taste are always happy with mediocrity," she replied, lifting her martini. "But let me be honest with you, you don't belong here. This isn't a charity, and it certainly isn't a social climbing ladder. Oak Crest is for those who've had wealth for generations, not for those who stumbled into it like a lucky lottery ticket." Her words stung, not because I believed them, but because of the smattering of chuckles around us. Other members had heard. They smirked into their glasses, validating her cruelty. I excused myself with as much dignity as I could muster. But in that moment, I made a promise to myself, not to simply belong there, but to own the ground she stood on. The plan didn't come overnight. Vengeance, I've learned, tastes better when it's slow cooked. I started small. A year later, I purchased the land adjacent to the club, a neglected golf practice range that had been losing money for decades. It seemed harmless, inconsequential even, but I knew Oak Crest used it unofficially for overflow events. With my signature, that option disappeared. 2 years later, I quietly began conversations with the board members, the real decision-makers behind the velvet curtains. Money has a way of softening tradition, especially when that tradition is drowning in debt. Oak Crest's grandeur was just a mask. Their financial books were bleeding. Membership was declining, repairs were costly, and the Carringtons of the world were more interested in flaunting pearls than paying overdue fees. At a charity gala one winter, I approached Henry Wexler, the club's treasurer, a man whose handshake trembled from arthritis and desperation. "I hear Oak Crest has had some financial strain," I said casually, as if discussing the weather. His eyes darted around nervously. "Clubs like this always fluctuate. We're fine." I slipped a check across the table, enough to cover their shortfall for the quarter. Think of this as a gesture of goodwill. I like Oakcrest. I'd hate to see it fall apart." Henry stared at the check, his lips quivering. He pocketed it. "You're very generous." Generous. That was the word they used when they needed you. Poor was the word they used when they wanted to hurt you. I let them call me generous for another 2 years while I quietly bought influence, favor, and eventually debt. By the time I made my official offer to purchase controlling interest in Oakcrest, half the board was already in my pocket. The day the deal closed, I walked into the same foyer where Vivian had humiliated me. She was there as if fate had scheduled her entrance. She narrowed her eyes. "What are you doing here again?" I smiled, savoring the moment. "Actually, I'm not here again. I'm here to stay. Oakcrest now belongs to me." The color drained from her face. "You're lying." I handed her the official letter, embossed, signed, sealed. "As of this morning, I own Oakcrest Country Club, which means, Vivian, your membership is revoked." Her hand shook as she grabbed the paper, her eyes scanning furiously. "You can't do this. My family has been here for generations." "Exactly," I replied coolly, "and it's time for a new generation to take over." Her voice cracked, shrill with panic. "You wouldn't dare." "Oh, I already did." I nodded to the security guard, who stepped forward with a sympathetic but firm look. Vivian sputtered, her pearls trembling against her throat, as the guard extended his hand for her membership card. In that moment, the whispers around us weren't laughter anymore. They were awe, fear, and the realization that the man they once dismissed now dictated their access to the very institution they de-used to measure superiority. Vivian's membership card snapped between her manicured fingers as she tried to hold on to it. Then, slowly, she placed it into the guard's hand. I leaned closer, my voice low but unmistakable. "Next time you call someone poor, Vivian, make sure they're not the one signing your eviction notice." Her eyes burned with hatred as she turned and stormed out, the echo of her heels now hollow, stripped of power. And me? I stood there, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and the ghosts of old money, knowing I had done more than avenge an insult. I had rewritten the rules of belonging, but the real story of how I dismantled her world piece by piece, the deals, the secrets, the betrayals, that was only just beginning. The morning after the festival, the air smelled faintly of grilled corn and damp grass. The lawns were littered with paper lanterns and crumpled flyers, but the energy was unmistakable. Oakcrest had shifted. Families who once drove past its iron gates with bitter indifference had walked its halls and danced under its lights. I walked the grounds with Miguel, who bent to collect a forgotten child's toy truck from the pond's edge. "Do you hear that?" he asked, pausing. "Hear what?" He grinned. "Nothing. No complaints, no whispers of who should not have been here, just silence, and silence means people are satisfied." It wasn't silence for long. By noon, the phones were ringing in the administrative office. New membership applications, emails asking about event space rentals. A local nonprofit wanted to host their annual fundraiser at Oakcrest for the first time. The numbers were swelling, the tide of change turning into something undeniable. But Vivian wasn't gone. She never would be. 3 days later, a glossy feature appeared in the Gazette. It bore her byline, of course, and the headline dripped with disdain. "Oakcrest or Oak-wrecked? How a social experiment threatens our town's legacy." She painted me as a reckless interloper, someone who had bought the club to indulge in ego rather than tradition. She called the festival a carnival on hallowed ground. I read the article in my office, the chandelier above me swaying gently from the draft of the open window. Henry barged in, flushed. "This is war, you know. She wanted to stop until she's convinced the whole town you redesecrating something sacred." I folded the paper calmly. "Then let her scream into the wind. Every day she wages war, we build something people can actually use." Still, I wasn't naive. Words have power. If she couldn't beat me with bylaws, she would try to poison perception. And so I sharpened my own weapon, transparency. We launched a quarterly financial report, publicly available to members and, by deliberate design, to the press. For the first time in Oakcrest's history, anyone could see where the money came from and where it went. The old guard balked at the exposure, but new members applauded. Vivian scoffed, calling it a vulgar parade of numbers. But when the reports showed record-breaking profits from community events and sustainable membership growth, her words rang hollow. Then came the invitation. It arrived one morning in an envelope sealed with crimson wax. Inside was a thick card embossed in silver script. You are cordially invited to the Carrington Winter Ball, celebrating tradition and heritage. An evening for those who remember who truly belongs. Vivian wasn't subtle. It was her counterstrike, a rival event designed to split loyalty, to prove she still commanded the social heartbeat of Oakcrest's old bloodlines. I considered ignoring it, but then I thought of the sneers in the foyer, the way she had once dismissed me with a single word, poor, and I knew this was a battlefield I couldn't abandon. So I went. The Carrington estate glowed that evening, its windows spilling golden light onto the snow-laced drive. Men in tuxedos and women in sequined gowns filled the ballroom, a space heavy with crystal and expectation. When I entered, the chatter dimmed for a moment, a ripple of curiosity spreading. Vivian glided toward me in a dress of midnight velvet, her pearls catching the light like frost. "Well," she purred, "I'm surprised you came. I didn't think you'd have the courage to step into a room where you aren't adored." I met her gaze without blinking. "Adoration isn't necessary. Respect is enough." She laughed, a brittle sound. "Respect is earned over generations, not bought overnight." Before I could respond, a voice cut through the music. "She's earned it more than you, Vivian." It was Jacob, the bartender she'd once driven to tears. He stood near the punch table, speaking louder than etiquette allowed. "She treats us like people, not servants, not placeholders. People." Murmurs spread like wildfire. A teacher chimed in from across the room. "And she opened Oakcrest to us. My students practiced in a ballroom last week because of her." Vivian's smile cracked, but she tried to steady it. "This is my home, not a soapbox." I leaned closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "This isn't about my presence, Vivian. It's about your absence. You've been so busy guarding your gates that you forgot what it feels like to welcome anyone through them." Her eyes narrowed. "You think you've won?" "I think Oakcrest has," I said. The night ended without explosions, but the shift was undeniable. By choosing confrontation on her own ground, I had revealed something. The Carrington name no longer commanded unquestioned loyalty. Weeks turned into months. Oakcrest thrived. The scholarship fund doubled. Membership grew across demographics the club had never touched before. Families who'd never dreamed of walking past its gates now picnicked on its lawns. The portraits on the walls remained, but they no longer sneered. They watched, almost humbled, as new history layered itself over old. Vivian retreated. Not entirely. She still whispered, still wrote biting columns. But her circle was shrinking. Her allies were tired of losing battles. Her attempts at sabotage rang petty against the backdrop of genuine progress. And yet, I never dismissed her completely. She was a reminder of what power looks like when hoarded, of what cruelty feels like when disguised as tradition. One evening, nearly a year after that first confrontation in the foyer, I walked the halls alone. The chandeliers glowed softly. The floors gleamed. On a side table sat a framed newspaper clipping. Oakcrest Reborn, from exclusion to community beacon. I stood there for a long time, remembering her voice hissing the word poor, remembering the sting that had carved its way into my bones. and I realized something unexpected. The victory wasn't owning Oakcrest, or revoking her membership, or even silencing her campaigns. The real victory was this. When people walked into Oakcrest now, they didn't ask, "Do I belong?" They asked, "How can I contribute?" And that was a question worth every battle. The war didn't begin with fire and lawsuits. It began with whispers. Within a month of the gala sabotage, I started hearing the phrase "Legacy Hall" everywhere. At luncheons, at the farmer's market, even at the barber shop downtown. Vivian had seeded the idea carefully, and it spread like ivy. A new, exclusive club, tucked away on an old Carrington estate, where the chosen few could escape the spectacle Oakcrest had become. Miguel told me first. He'd overheard landscapers talking about renovating the grounds at the edge of town. "They say it will have marble floors, private dining rooms, no public events," he said, shaking his head. "Like a palace with no doors." Henry confirmed it a week later. He dropped a thick file onto my desk. "She's filing permits under a shell company," he said. "But make no mistake, it's Vivian. She's calling in every favor, every family name she can." I leafed through the documents, anger simmering. "She's trying to resurrect the very thing Oakcrest was choking on when I bought it." Henry leaned forward, his voice low. "She doesn't want a club. She wants a counterweight. If she can split loyalty, she can bleed Oakcrest dry. You have to decide, do you fight her directly, or make Oakcrest so indispensable she becomes irrelevant?" I didn't answer right away, because I knew the truth. It couldn't be one or the other. It had to be both. The first strike came quietly. Vivian S. lawyer sent me a letter claiming Oakcrest's use of its grounds for public festivals violated the spirit of the original charter. She threatened to sue if I didn't restore the sanctity of membership. I read the letter twice, then slid it across to Henry. "File it," I said. He blinked. "You're not going to respond?" "Not yet. She wants me to fight her in court, where she can paint herself as the defender of tradition. Instead, we'll fight her in the daylight." Daylight meant press conferences, open forums, and transparency. I invited the Gazette and the regional papers to tour Oakcrest. I let them see the scholarship kids practicing music in the ballroom, the veterans using the library, the tennis clinics filled with children who once thought the club untouchable. Reporters asked about Legacy Hall, and I smiled calmly. Oakcrest belongs to the community. If someone wishes to build walls elsewhere, that's their choice. But history will remember which place fed its town and which place hid from it. The headlines turned in our favor. Oakcrest's new legacy, a club for all. Vivian countered with a glossy magazine spread of her own, staged photos of her sipping champagne beside marble fireplaces, surrounded by the few allies she had left. The article dripped with words like prestige, heritage, and exclusivity. It was a declaration of war printed on high-quality paper, but cracks were showing. One night, I received a call from Jacob. "Ma'am, you should know something," he whispered. "I was bartending at a private dinner. Some of her people are already grumbling. The dues she's charging are outrageous, and they don't even have the amenities yet. They're paying for a fantasy, and it's wearing thin." I smiled grimly. "Thank you, Jacob. Keep your ears open. The fantasy always collapses under the weight of reality." Still, I wasn't foolish enough to underestimate her. Vivian thrived on desperation, and desperate people can do dangerous things. It was Miguel who found the first sign. A week before Oakcrest's summer festival, he discovered someone had poisoned the soil near the rose gardens. Entire rows of flowers wilted overnight, blackened at the stems. "They used herbicide," he said, furious. "Strong enough to kill everything it touched." I clenched my fists. She's not just fighting with words anymore, she's trying to scar the land itself. We replaced the roses, of course, but I left one blackened row untouched during the festival, a silent testament to what had been done. When people asked, I told them the truth. This is what happens when hate tries to destroy beauty. We chose to plant more, but we left one row as a reminder. The story spread faster than any glossy magazine. Oakcrest wasn't just surviving Vivian's attacks. It was thriving because of them. Every act of sabotage became another rallying cry, another reason for the town to claim ownership of the club. And yet, I knew Vivian wasn't finished. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the manicured lawns, a letter appeared on my desk. No seal, no return address, just my name written in a familiar, sharp hand. Inside was a single sentence. If you won't surrender Oakcrest, then I'll destroy what you've built around it. I stared at the words, my pulse steady but heavy. She wasn't bluffing. Vivian's pride had curdled into something darker, something dangerous. This wasn't about Oakcrest anymore. It was about me. And as I folded the letter, I realized the war had entered its final stage. Because if Vivian wanted to tear down everything I had built, then I would have to expose everything she had tried to hide. And her secrets, I knew, were more poisonous than any herbicide. The threat lingered like smoke in my lungs. I kept the letter in my drawer, not out of fear, but as a reminder. Vivian had declared she was no longer playing a social game. She was out for blood. The very next week, Oakcrest's summer festival kicked off under a blazing sun. Children dashed across the greens, musicians set up beneath the shade of oak trees, and vendors filled the air with the scent of roasted corn and sweet pastries. It should have been perfect. Instead, chaos struck at dusk. The sprinklers turned on mid-performance, drenching the orchestra and sending people shrieking. Food stalls collapsed under sudden torrents of water. Parents grabbed their children, scrambling for cover as the carefully planned festival dissolved into soaked confusion. I ran to the maintenance building and found Miguel already inside, cursing as he wrestled with the control panel. The sprinkler system hadn't malfunctioned. It had been overridden. "They hacked it," he spat. "Someone rewired the timing box." I didn't need to guess who. The next morning, photos of soaked guests filled the front page of the Gazette. Vivian wasted no time feeding the press. "This is what happens when amateurs run Oakcrest," she told them, smiling as if butter wouldn't melt on her tongue. Tradition prevented this kind of chaos. Now, it's a circus. It might have worked, if not for the video. A local teenager had been filming the festival for her school project. She caught the exact moment two men in dark jackets slipped into the maintenance shed minutes before the sprinklers erupted. The footage went viral online within hours. They weren't Oakcrest staff. They were contractors tied to one of Vivian's shell companies. The story turned like a knife. What she meant as humiliation became scandal. Headlines roared, "Carrington linked to Oakcrest sabotage." Vivian denied everything, of course. She called it a smear campaign. She claimed she'd never hired those men. But the contracts told another story. Henry, meticulous as always, dug up payment trails connecting the men to her cousin's construction firm. "She can lie to the papers," he said, slapping the evidence on my desk, "but she can't lie to numbers." I considered taking it to court immediately, but something told me to wait. Vivian was cornered, and a cornered enemy always lashes out. I didn't have to wait long. One night, I returned home to find my driveway blocked by a sleek black car. Vivian stepped out, wrapped in a silk coat despite the summer heat. She looked tired, lines sharper around her eyes, pearls hanging too heavy on her neck. But her voice was still venom. "You think you've won?" she said, the headlights casting her face in harsh relief. "But you don't understand. Oakcrest isn't yours. It was never yours. You bought it, but it rejects you. People like you don't belong in its walls." I leaned against my car door, arms folded. "Funny. I've seen more belonging here in the last year than Oakcrest had in its entire history under you." Her hand shook slightly, but she forced a laugh. "You're naive. These people you welcomed, they'll turn on you. They always do. Money only listens to money, and mine runs deeper than yours ever will. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Then maybe it's time people see where your money really comes from. For the first time, her mask cracked. Just a flicker, but I caught it. Fear. I'd suspected for months that her fortune wasn't as pristine as she claimed. Old family money, yes, but supplemented by backroom deals, shady loans, maybe even fraud. Now her reaction told me I was right. She recovered quickly, sneering. "Careful, darling. If you dig too deep, you might bury yourself." Then she slid back into her car and disappeared into the night, leaving me with the echo of her threat. The next day, I convened with Henry and Miguel in my office. "She's desperate," I said, "and desperate people make mistakes. We're going to find hers." Henry frowned. "You're talking about digging into the Carrington finances. That's dangerous. She'll call it defamation." "Not if we have proof," I said. "Real proof. Something undeniable." Miguel leaned forward. "Then we dig quietly. We pull the weeds until her whole garden collapses." And so it began. We started with property records, tracing the Carrington estate holdings back decades, then business filings, corporate shells, and tax documents that were supposed to be buried in dusty archives. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged. Forged valuations, inflated loans, charities that existed only on paper. The Carrington legacy wasn't built on wealth alone. It was built on fraud. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. Vivian's fortune was a house of cards, and all I had to do was flick the right one. But timing mattered. Too soon, and she'd have room to fight back. Too late, and she might destroy Oakcrest in her death throes. As I stared at the mountain of evidence spread across my desk, I realized something chilling. Vivian thought she was defending her legacy, but what I was holding in my hands, the secrets she'd buried, could erase it forever. And I had to decide whether I was willing to scorch her world down to ash, because once I lit the match, there would be no going back. I slept badly that night, consciousness snagged on the edges of decisions I hadn't yet made. Dawn found me at my desk, the evidence arrayed like a map of a buried city. Ledgers with ink smudged in suspicious places, emails that vanished from servers, but resurfaced in printout shell company filings with the same P.O. box, repeated like a mantra. Each piece connected to another until the pattern read clear. The Carringtons had laundered influence the way some people laundered money, through charities, loans that never matured, favors swapped for silence. I could vsent everything to the press and watched it tear her life apart in morning headlines. That would be satisfying, brutal, immediate. But the town mattered more than satisfaction. Exposing Vivian had to be surgical. Collateral damage had to be minimized. Families who'd trusted Carrington charities, elderly volunteers who'd accepted token payments, teachers who'd taken donated computers, these were the people who could get hurt if the reveal was done recklessly. "We need an anchor," I told Henry and Miguel when we met in the conference room. "Someone whose reputation can't be denied and who will present this without sensationalism." Henry tapped his temple. "I know a reporter at the Gazette, Renee Alvarez. She's thorough, hates theatrics, and she won't run until she can corroborate everything." "We'll need legal protection," Miguel added. "This could get ugly fast." I nodded. "Get Renee. Get a lawyer who'll file a protective injunction if she sues. And—" I hesitated, thinking of Jacob and the staff who'd been humiliated and threatened. "Tell Jacob to gather statements. Anyone who's been hurt by her schemes gets to tell the truth in their own voice. No one speaks for them." They dispersed into the day like soldiers given orders. While they moved, I called in favors. A forensic accountant I'd met years before, a lawyer willing to take a case pro bono for the right cause, a friend at the county clerk's office who owed me a favor from a development dispute. It took tenacity and a little cash, the very thing Vivian had weaponized. But this time it bought truth. Renee arrived on a gray morning, notebook in hand, eyes that missed nothing. We walked the grounds. I showed her the records, the bank transfers anonymized and explained, the copies of emails that threaded the narrative together. She didn't react with headline hunger. She reacted with questions that cut to the root. Who benefited? Who signed off? What statutes were breached? "You understand the consequences," she said finally, looking up at me. "If we run this, it will ruin people. It will ruin a legacy. But it will also untangle a web that's been strangling this town." "That's the point," I answered. "It's not about ruin for sport. It's about accountability." Renee left with a promise to corroborate every claim. Over the next week, Henry and I built a chain of custody for the documents. Miguel collected statements from vendors and staff. Jacob recorded testimonies of employees who'd been pressured to stay silent. We triangulated bank records with contractor invoices and found a trail that led to not only Vivian, but a handful of trustees and a cousin who Dee served as the Carringtons' affixer. Vivian smelled blood in the water. Her responses sharpened. Legal threats, late-night calls to influential members, anonymous tip-offs to reporters about supposed fabrications. When the first subpoena arrived, her lawyer's name on the header, I felt relief rather than fear. It meant she'd had to hire someone to fight me in court. It meant she believed there was a fight to be had. The day we went public, we did it precisely. Renee's piece ran on a Thursday, not a wall of accusations, but a meticulously sourced investigation. Dates, bank entries, corroborated witness statements, scanned contracts that linked shell companies to Carrington accounts. The headline was simple: "Legacy under scrutiny, Carrington finances examined." It landed like a cold rain. Phones rang in the office, at homes, in the Carrington estate. I watched the town react, not as a mob, but as a community waking up. Some people called me vengeful. Others called me brave. But more important, those who had been complicit in silence began to speak. A trustee who'd once laughed in Vivian's parlor called a press conference and admitted, with a hand that trembled, that he'd turned a blind eye because he feared losing access. A charity director confessed the grants were diverted. The legal net tightened. Vivian's initial fury curdled into something stranger: panic. She appeared on television that evening, pearls and fury, denying everything in a practiced cadence. "These are lies concocted by someone who wants to destroy not just me, but our community," she declared. But the facts were patient, and they do their work whether or not someone shouts over them. The first police knock came not at my door, but at the Carrington estate. Investigators with warrants and evidence in hand descended. They moved with quiet professionalism, seizing ledgers, copying hard drives, cataloging jewelry that had been listed as charitable expenditures. The world watched through breathless feeds as the house that had once housed generations of pride became a scene of inquiries and questions. Vivian tried to flee the narrative by fleeing the town. She packed a small valise of designer scandal and took a private car. But there are no safe harbors when the law follows. Her escape was stalled at the county line when authorities intercepted her luggage with items inconsistently declared. The news cameras captured the moment. Her face, makeup smeared, eyes rimmed with a vulnerability she'd never shown in clubs or columns. When the charges were announced, fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to defraud charitable funds, the room where I sat with Henry felt both too small and too large. There was no triumphant glee in me, only a hollow sense of inevitability. It had to be done. It had to be legal. It had to be clean. Courtrooms have a way of taking the personal and rendering it into statutes and exhibits. Vivian's trial moved like machinery. Witnesses, timestamps, ledgers, phone logs. I watched her on the stand, not as the villain the papers had drawn, but as a woman stripped down to her naked choices. She cried sometimes. She laughed other times, bitterly. She tried to charm the jury with tired jokes about legacy. They didn't land. During a recess, she cornered me in the hallway, fingers gripping the strap of her handbag like a rosary. "You wanted this," she whispered. You wanted to be vindicated. I wanted Oakcrest to be honest, I replied. I wanted the town to stop being cheated. Her mouth twitched. You could have been kinder. You could have been kinder, I said. The verdict didn't feel like an ending so much as a clearing. Guilty on multiple counts, sentence pending. The Carrington name, once gilded and unassailable, was suddenly a case study in hubris. But the victory cost me things I hadn't anticipated. In the weeks after the verdict, some donors who had supported Oakcrest for reasons beyond status, people who enjoyed the quiet privacy of the club, pulled their support. Lawsuits cropped up from members who felt blindsided by the scrutiny. There were threats, anonymous and cowardly, delivered in the form of late-night phone calls and graffiti sprayed across a side gate. The war had reshaped the landscape. It wasn't a clean sweep. One rainy afternoon, as I walked the grounds picking up stray leaflets, Jacob found me and handed me a small folded note. Inside was a paragraph written in a steady inked hand. I was wrong. I saw only what I lost, not what we could have. Thank you for making this place better. It was unsigned, but I knew the handwriting. It was from a member who remained silent through the worst of it, a man whose donations once dictated policy. He'd quietly returned, renewed his commitment with a stipulation that Oakcrest continue its outreach programs. The rebuilding took years. Not the grand renovations, the parks and programs, but the quiet repair. Trust rebuilt table by table, neighbor by neighbor. We created oversight committees, financial transparency laws for clubs receiving public funds, and an annual audit committee that included community members chosen by lottery. Oakcrest became dull, then sturdy. It became a place that invited questions and answered them. As for Vivian, she served her sentence. Prison changed some people in ways that are private and stubborn. When she was released, a thinner woman with a quieter voice, she asked to meet me. We sat across from each other in the now smaller dining room, a table that had once been the stage for her pronouncements, and she apologized, not in a grand or theatrical way, but in small, honest sentences. I was terrified of becoming invisible, she said. I mistook hiding for dignity. You hid from your mistakes, I said, but you can still choose what you do now. Her eyes flicked to the windows where children played on the lawn. Do you forgive me? Forgiveness is not a switch to be flipped. It's a slow process, like planting seeds and waiting for new grass to take root. I thought of the rows of replaced roses, of the scholarship winners, of Jacob's steady smile behind the bar. Yes, I said finally, but only if you help. Oakcrest doesn't need you to be erased. It needs you to repair. She nodded, and the nod felt like the beginning of something fragile and human. Years later, when the town marked the 50th anniversary of Oakcrest's founding, the event felt different than any plaque unveiling I'd attended. There was a small ceremony honoring the children's choir, a plaque recognizing transparency reforms, and a modest donation from the Carrington estate designated for veteran services, the last of its kind, tightly overseen. Standing there, watching people from all walks of life mingle with an ease that had been unthinkable before, I realized the point of all the battles. It wasn't to bury a woman or brand a name. It was to make a place where the question, "Do I belong?" no longer landed like a stone in a person's gut. It was to make belonging mean responsibility. The chandeliers still gleamed. The portraits still watched. But now, when someone new walked through the gates, they were met not by a judge's stare, but by a volunteer handing them a program and a smile. And on the far edge of the lawn, where one blackened row of roses once stood, a new bed of blooms had been planted, wild, generous, and impossibly bright, like a wound healed into something living. The 50th anniversary celebration had ended hours ago, but I stayed behind, wandering Oakcrest's grounds in the hush of twilight. The paper lanterns still glowed faintly, strung between oaks whose branches swayed like tired dancers. Laughter from the day lingered in the grass, and the choir-ass voices seemed to echo even after they packed up their sheet music. I stopped at the rose bed. It was no longer just a scar. Miguel and his crew had turned it into a small memorial garden, lined with benches and a bronze plaque that read, "From exclusion to belonging, Oak Crest remembers its past to honor its future." The plaque wasn't about me, not really. It was about all of us. The teachers, the staff, the children, the veterans, even the members who'd stayed through the storm. Still, I felt the weight of my own footsteps there. The memory of that first insult in the foyer when Vivian had looked me in the eye and called me poor. A voice pulled me back. "You come here often at night?" It was Vivian. She stood at the edge of the garden, wrapped in a simple wool coat. No pearls, no velvet gowns, just a woman older than she used to be, carrying the gravity of her choices. I studied her carefully. "Sometimes," I admitted, "it helps me remember why we fought." Her eyes swept the roses, and for the first time, I didn't see disdain in them, just weariness. I used to think this place was ours to protect, like a crown that couldn't be shared. But maybe what I was protecting wasn't Oak Crest at all. Maybe it was just my fear. I said nothing. The silence felt like an open space where truth could settle. She drew a breath. "Do you know what the hardest part was? Not the trial, not the sentence. It was waking up in a place where no one cared who I was, where my name meant nothing." "That must have been humbling," I said. "It was annihilating," she corrected softly. "And then, slowly, it became freeing. I learned to live without a stage, without a banner, without the word Carrington as armor." She paused. "But I can't erase the damage I did." "No," I said, "but you can choose not to repeat it." Her gaze lifted to mine, steady. "I'd like to help, quietly. No spotlight. Just help." I didn't answer immediately. Memories of her sabotage, the poisoned roses, the sprinklers, the smear campaigns, still lived in my chest like old scars. But Miguel's words came back to me. You could tear apart for revenge, or you could build for legacy. "Then help," I said finally. "We don't need perfection. We need hands willing to plant." For the next months, she did. Quietly at first, volunteering to catalog the club's archives, baking for staff potlucks, writing checks so modest they would have once embarrassed her. Some people still turned cold shoulders, unwilling to forgive, but others nodded, acknowledging the effort. One afternoon, I found her kneeling in the memorial garden, dirt on her palms, pressing new bulbs into the soil. She looked up with a rueful smile. "You were right," she said. "Belonging isn't inherited. It's cultivated." And for the first time, I believed her. Years blurred into a rhythm. Oak Crest became a living thing, its identity no longer rooted in exclusion but in contribution. The festivals grew into traditions. The scholarship fund sent dozens of students to college. Veterans found refuge in its library. Children learned tennis on its courts. Choirs filled its halls. The portraits of old founders still hung on the walls, but they seemed smaller now, dwarfed by new photographs, community festivals, scholarship winners, civic leaders honored for service. History wasn't erased, it was reframed. On the 20th anniversary of my ownership, a crowd gathered again under the chandeliers. The mayor presented me with a plaque, but I handed it immediately to the staff, to Miguel, to Jacob, to the teachers who had believed when it was hardest. "Places are not made by walls," I told the crowd. "They are made by the people who choose to step inside and leave them better than they found them." As the applause washed over me, I saw Vivian at the back of the room, standing quietly. She wasn't clapping, her hands were folded in front of her, but her eyes met mine, and for once there was no venom, no pride, just acknowledgement. Later that night, as the lights dimmed and the guests trickled out, I walked through the foyer alone. The same foyer where she had once spit the word poor at me like a curse. But tonight, I smiled. Because poor or rich, past or present, I understood something at last. Wealth wasn't measured in inheritance or in marble halls. It was measured in what survived after pride was stripped away. And Oakcrest, alive and thriving, was proof of that. I laid my hand on the plaque in the garden before leaving, whispering to the roses, "This is what belonging looks like." And for the first time in my life, I knew the war was truly over. Autumn came to Oakcrest with a gentleness I'd never felt before. The air carried wood smoke from nearby houses, and the oaks turned their leaves into blazing crowns of amber and crimson. Where once the season would have been marked by stiff dinners and hollow charity galas, now it meant harvest festivals, scholarship announcements, and neighbors streaming through the gates without hesitation. One evening, as I stood by the terrace overlooking the twinkling town, Henry joined me. His hair had silvered, his arthritis slowed him, but his eyes still burned with that same mix of caution and loyalty. "You ever think back to that first day here?" he asked. "When she—" He hesitated, unwilling to say Vivian's name, or maybe just unwilling to give her insult power again. "I think about it often," I admitted. "It lit the fire under everything that followed. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just walked away that day." Henry chuckled softly. "Then Oakcrest would have crumbled, and the town with it, bit by bit. Sometimes the ugliest wounds force the deepest healing." We fell into silence, watching children dart around the lawn below, chasing each other with glow sticks from the evening's festival. Not long after, Vivian approached me with an idea of her own. "I want to start a program," she said one afternoon in the memorial garden, dirt smudging her gloves. "For women leaving prison, work training, small grants, a place to start again. I know what it feels like to leave with nothing." I studied her, wondering if this was another play, another attempt at redemption through spectacle. But her voice lacked the rehearsed sharpness it once carried. It was rough, uneven, almost fragile. "That program could save lives," I said. "But it has to be theirs, not yours. No Carrington banners, no grandstanding." She nodded. "No banners, just work." And so it began. Quietly, like most good things. The women came in small numbers at first, then more, drawn by word of mouth. Some cleaned rooms at Oakcrest, others helped with events, others found jobs through contacts Vivian had once wielded for vanity, but now offered with humility. It didn't erase her past, but it carved something new into her legacy. Years layered over years. Oakcrest grew not larger, but deeper, its roots entwined with the town until they were inseparable. The roses bloomed every spring, their memorial plaque weathered by sun and rain, their colors bolder than memory. On my final day as Oakcrest's steward, I walked through the foyer one last time. The chandeliers glowed as they always had, but I didn't feel dwarfed by them anymore. I felt equal, steady, unshaken. The portraits on the walls, those old men with their stiff collars and inherited arrogance, seemed smaller now, irrelevant to the pulse of life around them. The board, reformed and diverse, had asked me to stay on as honorary chair, but it was time to pass the torch. Oakcrest was no longer about me. It was about the children practicing violins in the ballroom, the veterans laughing in the library, the families planting flowers in the garden. As I stepped outside, Vivian was waiting near the gates. Older now, her hair white, her frame thinner, but her eyes clearer than I'd ever seen. "You kept your promise," she said. "And you kept yours," I replied. She glanced at the garden, where new roses had just begun to bud. "Funny, isn't it? That one word, poor, could start all this." I smiled faintly. Sometimes the cruelest sparks light the brightest fires. She gave a small nod, then slipped her hands into her coat pockets. For once, she didn't need the last word. I walked away from Oakcrest that evening, not as the outsider I once was, not as the owner who'd reclaimed it through revenge, but as someone who had finally learned what true wealth meant. Not the size of one's fortune, but the breadth of one's legacy. And behind me, the laughter of the community rose, carrying with it the sound of a place that had finally, irrevocably, become whole. Winter arrived with a hush that softened everything. Snow blanketing the lawns, icicles hanging from the eaves of the clubhouse, the pond freezing into a mirror where children skated with scarves flapping in the wind. Oakcrest, once a symbol of exclusion, had become a living hearth for the town. I visited less often now, letting the new board carry the rhythm of daily life. But every so often I'd walk through the gates, greeted not as an outsider or even as the owner, but simply as part of the community. That was how I wanted it. One evening I returned for the Winter Lights Festival, a tradition that had outgrown even my imagination. Thousands of tiny bulbs wound around the trees, turning the grounds into a constellation of earthbound stars. Music drifted from the ballroom, and the scent of cinnamon and cider clung to the cold air. I spotted Miguel near the bonfire, older now but still proud, his hands resting on the shoulders of his grandchildren. Jacob manned a booth serving spiced cocoa, smiling easily with the staff who had become family. Teachers handed out awards to scholarship students, their faces lit by both firelight and pride. And then I saw Vivian. She stood near the memorial garden, bundled in a simple wool coat, her white hair shining under the lights. She was speaking with a small circle of women, graduates from her re-entry program, I realized. They laughed with her, embraced her, treated her not as a fallen Carrington, but as someone who had helped them stand again. When she noticed me, she excused herself and walked over slowly, her breath visible in the frosty air. "You don't come around as much," she said gently, no accusation in her tone. "It's their turn," I replied, nodding toward the board members bustling between events. "Oakcrest doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to them." She looked around, her eyes misty. "I spent half my life trying to keep people out. You spent yours opening doors. I envy that." I studied her carefully, then asked, "Do you regret it?" Vivian hesitated. The question seemed to press on her like the weight of all those years, all those battles, all those choices. Finally, she said, "Every day. But regret isn't enough. That's why I keep showing up. That's why I plant flowers, sweep floors, write checks when I can. Because maybe one day, the regret will turn into something useful." For the first time, I believed her completely. We stood in silence, watching children chase each other with glowing lanterns, their laughter carrying through the crisp night. The memorial roses, now dusted with snow, glowed faintly beneath the lights strung overhead. They had endured frost, storms, sabotage, and still they bloomed each spring. I turned back to her. "Legacies aren't marble or money, Vivian. They're gardens, and gardens need tending." Her lips curved into the smallest smile. Then maybe in the end, we tended the same one. The church bells downtown chimed, and the festival erupted into cheers. Families lifted mugs of cocoa, choirs began to sing, and Oakcrest glowed brighter than I had ever seen it. As I walked away that night, the snow crunching beneath my boots, I realized the journey that had begun with a single cruel word had ended here. In light, in laughter, in community stronger than pride or vengeance. And for the first time, I felt not just victorious, not just vindicated. I felt at peace. Years later, the peace I found became less a fleeting feeling and more the soil in which my life took root. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, and though the battles at Oakcrest had once consumed me, they now felt like distant thunder, loud in memory, but gentle in the present. Oakcrest itself flourished beyond what I could have dreamed. The scholarships had multiplied into full fellowships, sending dozens of young people each year to universities across the country. The Veterans Library expanded into a community resource center, buzzing with tutoring programs, counseling sessions, and history projects. The annual festivals became town-wide holidays, woven into the rhythm of life so deeply that children grew up believing they had always been there. And Vivian, strangely, almost impossibly, found her place too. She never reclaimed her old grandeur, nor did she try. Instead, she walked in humility. Her re-entry program grew into one of the state's most respected, a network that reached far beyond Oakcrest. She attended board meetings quietly, often sitting in the back, taking notes rather than speaking. Some still distrusted her, and perhaps they always would, but she bore it without defense. It was her penance, and she seemed to accept it. One crisp autumn day, I was invited back to Oakcrest, not as its owner or its savior, but as its guest of honor. The board had decided to dedicate a wing of the clubhouse to the Renewal Years, a permanent exhibit chronicling the transformation from exclusion to belonging. When I arrived, the air buzzed with anticipation. Children darted about, tugging on their parents' hands, eager to see the new displays. Inside, the foyer had been subtly redesigned, not erased, but reframed. Alongside the old portraits now hung photographs of the festivals, the scholarships, the programs that had reshaped the club. At the center stood a bronze sculpture of intertwined hands holding a single rose in bloom. The plaque beneath it read, "To those who turned insult into inspiration and exclusion into community, may Oakcrest always belong to all." As I traced the letters with my eyes, I felt a hand rest lightly on my arm. Vivian stood beside me, older now, her frame frailer but her gaze steady. "They told me you didn't want statues," she said softly. "I didn't," I admitted. "But this isn't for me. It's for everyone who fought to change this place, even you." Her lips curved into a small, wistful smile. "Then maybe I get to belong after all." We stood there together, the echoes of the past all around us, the insult in the foyer, the war in the courts, the nights of sabotage and roses burned to ash. And yet here we were, in a room full of laughter, surrounded by children who would never know those battles, only the peace that had grown from them. Later, as evening fell and lanterns lit the pathways, I walked alone to the memorial garden. The roses were in bloom again, scarlet and white, defiant against the creeping chill of autumn. I sat on one of the benches and closed my eyes, listening to the hum of life around me, music from the ballroom, footsteps on gravel, the distant sound of children's voices. It struck me then with clarity. This had never truly been a story about revenge, though it had begun that way. It had been about transformation, about taking the sharpest insult, the cruelest dismissal, and turning it into a foundation for belonging, about rewriting what wealth, legacy, and community meant. I opened my eyes and whispered to the roses, "We did it." The wind stirred the blooms gently, as if in answer, and in that moment, I knew the story of Oakcrest was no longer mine to tell. It belonged to the generations who would live it, tend it, and bloom within it, long after I was gone. Spring returned once more, and with it came a sense of renewal that carried deeper meaning than in any year before. My visits to Oakcrest had grown infrequent. I had stepped back long ago, but whenever I crossed its gates, it was like revisiting a living memory that had learned how to grow without me. The new board had done wonders. Oakcrest now partnered with schools across the county, hosting annual science fairs in the ballroom and outdoor art exhibits on the lawns. The tennis courts doubled as spaces for youth tournaments, and the golf greens, once reserved for whispers and exclusivity, were used by high school teams who practiced with a joy unburdened by history. I walked slowly along the paths, cane in hand now, though I resisted relying on it too much. Miguel's grandson stopped me by the garden, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Do you want to see the new mural?" he asked. He led me to the outer wall of the clubhouse, where a vibrant painting stretched across the bricks. It depicted Oakcrest through the years, the old portraits and chandeliers, the festivals and choirs, the roses blackened, then blooming again. At the center, people of all walks of life stood hand in hand beneath a banner that read, "Belonging is the truest legacy." I touched the wall lightly, feeling the texture of paint beneath my fingers. For a moment, the years collapsed. The humiliation in the foyer, the Cold War of sabotage, the courtroom battles, the roses replanted. All of it had led here, to this mural created by children who had never known exclusion, only community. A voice behind me spoke, softer now, aged with time. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I turned and saw Vivian. She was older than I remembered, her posture stooped, her steps careful. But her eyes, those sharp Carrington eyes, were gentler than I'd ever seen. She carried a small bouquet of roses, not white or red, but a mix of colors, tied together with a plain ribbon. "They asked me to help with the garden this spring," she said. "I told them I'd rather bring flowers than plant them. My knees don't forgive me like they used to." I smiled faintly. Bringing flowers counts. She placed the bouquet at the base of the mural. For a moment, her hand lingered there, trembling. "I spent so much of my life clinging to the idea that legacy meant power," she whispered. "But I look around now, and I see that legacy is what survives you. And this," she gestured at the mural, at the children laughing nearby, at the roses blooming behind us, "this survived." Silence settled between us. Not hostile, not heavy, simply full of everything unspoken. "You once asked me if I regretted it," she said finally. "The answer's still yes. But now, I think I've learned how to make peace with regret, how to live alongside it, instead of letting it consume me." I nodded slowly. "That's all anyone can do." She turned to me, her eyes glistening. "Do you forgive me?" I looked at her for a long time, seeing not the woman who had called me poor in a marble foyer, but the woman who had survived disgrace, who had rebuilt in humility, who had kept showing up with hands willing to help. "Yes," I said at last. "I forgive you." She exhaled a sound halfway between a sigh and a sob, and for the first time in decades, I saw Vivian not as an enemy, not as an icon of arrogance, but as a human being simply trying to find peace. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light over Oakcrest, the mural glowing as if lit from within. Children ran past us, laughter ringing across the garden, and I thought, this is what we fought for. Not revenge, not victory, but this, life continuing, richer and fuller than before. As evening fell, I left Oakcrest with one last look at the roses. They swayed gently in the breeze, bright and resilient, a testament to every wound that had once threatened to destroy them. And I knew, with a certainty as steady as the earth beneath my feet, that Oakcrest would endure. Long after me. Long after Vivian. Because belonging, once planted, grows roots deeper than pride, and deeper than time. Summer arrived with a brilliance that made Oakcrest lawns glow emerald, and its fountains glitter like jewels. By then, my life had slowed. Mornings were quiet, afternoons gentler. Yet whenever I came through those familiar gates, the place seemed to meet me halfway, alive, bustling, but never foreign. This time, I was invited for a ceremony unlike any other. The board had decided to retire the old oil portraits from the foyer, the stern faces of men who had ruled Oakcrest as their private kingdom for generations. Not to erase them, but to relocate them to a historical archive, framed with context about what Oakcrest once was and how it had changed. In their place, the foyer would house a rotating gallery, photographs of current members, events, and milestones. A living history instead of a frozen one. I sat in the front row of the ballroom as the unveiling began. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, eager to see which photos had been chosen this season. Teachers whispered with veterans, neighbors greeted each other warmly. When the curtain fell, gasps rippled through the crowd. There, in the center, hung a photograph of the memorial rose garden in full bloom. Families were gathered around it, children running between the benches, musicians playing beneath the oaks. At the bottom, a small inscription read, "The heart of Oakcrest is not its walls, but its people." Applause filled the room, but my eyes blurred. Because I remembered the day those roses had been blackened by sabotage. I remembered leaving one row unhealed, a scar for the world to see. And now, here they were, reborn, celebrated, immortalized in a photograph that spoke louder than any speech. After the ceremony, I stepped into the garden itself, cane tapping lightly against the path. Vivian was already there, seated on a bench, her hands folded in her lap. She looked thinner, paler, the years finally pressing down with a weight she could no longer shrug off. But her eyes were calm. "They're beautiful this year," she said softly, nodding at the roses. "They always are," I replied. We sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the festival carrying faintly from the clubhouse, the laughter of children, the clink of glasses, the swell of music. She broke the silence first. "I don't have much time left. The doctors have been honest with me." I turned to her, the words heavy but not surprising. "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "Don't be. I had a long life, a foolish one for too much of it. But I've had these years to put some of it right. That's more than most get." Her gaze fixed on the roses, as if they held the answer to something unspoken. "Promise me," she whispered, "that Oakcrest will never forget what it was and what it became. Not for my sake, but so no one ever makes the same mistakes again." I laid my hand gently over hers. "I promise. Oakcrest will remember, not to punish, but to teach." She smiled faintly, her eyes closing for a moment as if the words eased something inside her. "Then maybe," she said, "I can rest when the time comes." We stayed there until the sun dipped low, the roses catching the last light of day, glowing as if lit from within. Weeks later, Vivian passed quietly in her sleep. The town mourned her in a way I hadn't expected. Not with grandeur, but with honesty. The newspapers remembered her as both the woman who once clung to exclusion and the woman who, in her final years, chose to repair instead of destroy. At her funeral, the choir she had once dismissed sang beneath the oaks, their voices carrying a note of grace that seemed to lift her name into forgiveness. And Oakcrest went on. The roses bloomed again the following spring, bright and defiant, their roots deep enough to survive any storm. Children played in the garden, couples strolled hand in hand, veterans sat on the benches telling stories. The past was still there, in the archives, in the plaques, in the memories, but it no longer haunted. It nourished. I knew then that my own time would come soon enough. But I also knew this. Oakcrest no longer needed me to stand guard. It belonged to the people, and it would endure because of them. And when I finally leave this world, I hope they plant a rose for me too. Not as a monument, but as a reminder that even the deepest wounds can bloom into something beautiful. The day came quietly, the way endings often do. I woke to the sound of birds outside my window, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street, and the warmth of sunlight spilling across the floor. My body was slower now, my steps measured, my hands lined with years of labor and forgiveness. That morning I felt an ache, not of pain, but of finality, a sense that the circle was nearly closed. I asked to be taken to Oakcrest one last time. The board arranged it without ceremony. No reporters, no grand announcements. Just a quiet drive through the gates I had once crossed as an unwelcome guest. The lawns spread before me, green and endless, alive with children's laughter and the hum of community. The foyer was different than I remembered from the day of my humiliation. The portraits of stern-faced founders were gone, replaced with photographs of music festivals, scholarship winners, neighborhood gatherings. The chandelier still glittered above, but instead of cold judgment, it cast warmth over people of every background moving easily through the halls. They wheeled me to the memorial garden. The roses were in full bloom, scarlet, ivory, golden, even lavender, planted by volunteers over the years. Their fragrance filled the air, mingling with the laughter of children chasing each other across the grass. I asked to be left alone for a while. The garden was quiet, except for the soft rustle of petals in the breeze. I closed my eyes and remembered everything. The venom of Vivian's insult, the fire of revenge that carried me, the nights of doubt, the battles in courts and headlines, the slow shift from vengeance to vision. I remembered her too, Vivian, fierce and flawed, who had become something human in the end. I hoped she had found the peace she sought. My hand brushed against the plaque at the base of the roses. From exclusion to belonging, Oakcrest remembers its past to honor its future. I smiled, because it was true. Oakcrest remembered, but it also endured. It thrived. It lived. As the sun dipped low, children's voices echoed faintly. Music floated from the ballroom, and the roses swayed as if in gentle farewell. I whispered my last words into the garden. This is what belonging looks like. And then, with the peace of a life that had turned insult into legacy, I let go. Years later, they planted a new row of roses in my honor. Not grand, not gilded, just a simple bed of blooms nestled among the others. Children played there, couples strolled by, and no one thought of ownership or status. They thought only of community. And Oakcrest, as I had always hoped, lived on, stronger than pride, deeper than time. Seasons passed, and the roses planted in my honor grew thick and wild, twining into the memorial garden until they looked as though they had always been there. Visitors often paused by them, not to mourn, but to smile. For by then, Oakcrest was not a place of sorrow, it was a place of stories. The board had expanded the archives into a permanent museum wing. Children on school trips wandered through exhibits where history was told with honesty, the exclusion, the arrogance, the cruelty, and the transformation that followed. One display showed the blackened roses alongside photos of the garden in full bloom. Another chronicled the scholarship program, now hundreds strong, with names etched into plaques that lined the walls like constellations of hope. In the center of the wing hung the mural, the community hand in hand beneath the words. Belonging is the truest legacy. Teachers pointed to it as they explained how Oakcrest had once been closed and narrow, but had learned to open its gates. The children, wide-eyed, didn't understand how it could ever have been otherwise. To them, Oakcrest was synonymous with welcome. Vivian's name appeared too, not as a villain erased from memory, but as a caution and a redemption. Her re-entry program had outlived her, expanded into a statewide initiative. Women she had helped start over often spoke at Oakcrest, their voices steady, their lives proof that even fractured legacies could be mended through service. And the garden, the garden became the heart of it all. Weddings took place among the roses, vows exchanged beneath the oaks. Veterans sat on benches, telling stories to children who listened with rapt attention. Families brought picnics, laughter echoing where once there had been silence and scorn. On the centennial of Oakcrest, the town gathered in numbers too great for the clubhouse alone. They set up stages and lanterns across the lawns, choirs sang, and the air filled with music and memory. At sunset, the mayor stepped forward and read a declaration. Oakcrest is not a monument to wealth or pride. It is a living testament to transformation, forgiveness, and community. To those who came before, who fought, who fell, who rebuilt, this legacy belongs to all of us. The crowd erupted in applause. Children released lanterns into the twilight sky, their lights drifting upward like new stars. The roses glowed in the dusk, their colors deep and defiant, as if they remembered every storm they had survived. And though my body had long returned to the earth, my presence lingered there, in the laughter, in the music, in the rustle of petals. Not as an owner, not as a victor, not even as a legend. Simply as someone who once planted the idea that belonging could grow where exclusion had ruled. And Oakcrest, faithful to that seed, kept blooming, year after year, generation after generation, forever. Decades flowed onward like a quiet river, and Oakcrest became less a club and more a cornerstone of the town itself. By the time a second century dawned, no one called it the country club anymore. Children knew it simply as Oakcrest Gardens. The clubhouse, though still standing, had changed its purpose. Its chandeliers still glittered, but now they shone over classrooms, rehearsal halls, and gathering spaces. The old bar had become a cafe where students studied late into the night. The ballroom hosted lectures as often as concerts, and the library had grown into a full-fledged community center, its shelves stacked with donated books and its walls alive with murals painted by local artists. The roses in the memorial garden had spread further than anyone expected. Caretakers had to build new paths just to wind through them all, each row dedicated to a generation, a story, a lesson. My row stood quietly among the rest, not grand, not central, but steady, surrounded by blooms planted by children who had never known the sting of exclusion. Oakcrest had become a place where every story was told. The archives expanded into a living exhibit, interactive, layered with voices, photographs, letters. Students could listen to recordings of the choir that once sang at Vivian's funeral, or read first-hand accounts from staff who remembered when Oakcrest transformed. Even Vivian's name was etched into a corner. Not glorified, not erased, but remembered as both wound and healer, proof that legacies could stumble into redemption. Every year, on the anniversary of its transformation, the town gathered in the gardens. They called it the blooming. Families arrived with baskets of flowers to plant in the beds. Children pressed seeds into the soil, learning that belonging must always be renewed, never assumed. At one such blooming, a young girl stood before the plaque in the garden, the one that read, "From exclusion to belonging, Oakcrest remembers its past to honor its future." She tugged at her grandmother's sleeve. "Why does it say that?" she asked. Her grandmother knelt, brushing her hand along the roses. "Because once, a woman was told she didn't belong here, and instead of walking away, she decided to make sure everyone could." The girl frowned. "That's silly. Why wouldn't everyone belong?" Her grandmother smiled softly. "That's the point, my love. You've grown up in a world where it is silly, and that means the roses are doing their job." The child nodded, satisfied, and ran off to play. The roses swayed gently, their petals catching the golden light of evening. And though my name was only one among many, and my story just a single thread in the tapestry of Oakcrest, I knew, even across time, even as memory faded into legend, that the garden kept whispering the truth. Belonging is planted, tended, and passed on. And as long as the roses bloomed, Oakcrest would never forget. Oakcrest's story began with arrogance and insult, but it did not end there. What was once a fortress of exclusion transformed into a living garden of belonging, through conflict, through scars, through the courage to face cruelty and the choice to answer it with vision. Oakcrest became proof that even the harshest beginnings can yield beauty when nurtured. The roses stood eternal, not as symbols of wealth or status, but as reminders that true legacy is not inherited. It is cultivated. Generations came and went, each adding their hands to the soil, each carrying forward the promise that no one would again be turned away at its gates. In the end, Oakcrest was no longer about who owned it, who controlled it, or who claimed to belong. It was about what it gave: community, hope, and the enduring truth that belonging, once planted, will bloom forever. That was the final conclusion, the triumph not of pride, but of humanity.